Welcome to Sacred Cow Shipyards, where no ship is safe from being crushed like a poorly constructed tin can being exposed to 400 atmospheres of pressure. Alright folks, we're going to set the tone for this episode right off the bat. Dark humor is like air. Not everybody gets it. And in that context, yes, we are actually going to talk about recent events on your planet on this channel. And we are going to talk about them in our usual flippant fashion. If that is not to your taste, fret not. Over 500 hours of content are uploaded to YouTube every minute. I am sure you can find something more your speed to watch than this episode. Because trust me, if you keep watching this episode and you try to come at me with your "I'm offended" nonsense, you will not only get no sympathy, you will be laughed at. In fact, I will get all the minions in the shipyard to laugh at you while we yeet you out the airlock. So please spare yourself the time of pounding out some comment I won't actually read beyond the first line, and spare me the effort of clicking two buttons to delete it and remove you from the shipyards. And if you can't tolerate black comedy or dark humor or gallows humor or whatever you want to call it, just go watch some other episode, okay? Fine. And just to give y'all the time you need to go somewhere else and watch something else, black humor, dark humor, black comedy, whatever you want to call it, is a fascinating insight into the human psychology. I mean, whatever else you might think of him, and there's a lot of things to think of him, Sigmund Freud thought that dark humor was basically the ego's way of insulating itself from trauma. The ego's way of saying that I can't be hurt by anything, and therefore everything that could hurt me is amusing. Well, I mean, in some regards, he's not wrong. Although he's massively wrong about other things, which is a whole separate conversation, which this channel is really not equipped for. But regardless, yes, dark humor is a coping mechanism for people who are in high-stress, high-risk environments, and for people who might die. They have to face death on a regular basis. So they resort to things like dark humor because they know deep down inside, whether they're willing to admit it or not, they might be next. And so, like with so many things, they laugh rather than cry. Crying doesn't get you anything. Laughing gets you camaraderie. If you can tell a good joke, everyone's there with you. If you cry, no one cares. So yes, dark humor is actually a bonding mechanism for humies who are in high-risk, high-danger environments. Because yeah, they know that the people they're laughing about could just as well have been them and might actually be them tomorrow. And man, I mean, they're kind of actually expecting to be laughed at if it is them. Unless you get some weird idea that this is some weird USA fault in their particular psychology. The term gallows humor actually traces back to the German expression Galgenhumor, which is basically your cynical last words before getting hanged. And yes, because German is German, Galgenhumor is all one word, because they smash all the words together. Such a weird language. I mean, for heaven's sake, the Mitsubishi G4M World War II bomber was actually referred to by the Japanese Empire as the Mitsubishi Navy Type 1 attack bomber. Fine. Different designations depending on whether you're Allied or Japanese, whatever. The pilots called it hamaki, which in English means cigar. That partially refers to its shape, long and nope, I'm not going to finish that idiom, but also the fact that any time it was shot, it spontaneously caught on fire. Yes, the pilots who flew it literally called it a flame bomb. Yeah, see, dark humor is built into every society on your planet everywhere. So, frankly, if you can't tolerate that, you really need to find a different channel to watch today because, oh my dear great maker, we're not going to spend a whole lot more time on the Titan, but what time we are going to spend on it is going to be full of memes. So that said, here's to a few people, and I'm probably going to mutilate their names, and I apologize for that in advance, but here we go. Here's to Shazda Dawood, and Suleiman Dawood, and Hamish Harding, and Paul-Henri Norjoulet. They went and did something awesome because they could, and they signed their name on the dotted line because, yes, apparently the disclosure they signed indicated that, yes, they could very well die. And lo and behold, they did. And they took on that risk, and they paid their significant coin and went and, well, died. So, I mean, credit for following through. On the other hand, Stockton Rush can go suck a duck. That imbecile got what was coming to him, not because he was rich, and I swear to God I will yeet any eat the rich imbecile faster than anything else in the shipyard ever. No, not because he was rich, simply because he was a goddamned moron. He fired the guy who told him that the Titan system was horrible and was eventually going to break. He went out of his way to not hire old white men and hire inspirational children for all intents and purposes, simply because he wanted to check some boxes as opposed to get some actual experience on his company. You want to know what would have kept him breathing air? Yeah. Some experience and some training from some old white guys who had been submariners before and knew what they were talking about. But you know what? Dark humor is kind of like pressure. Some people crumble under it. Although, I guess, technically, in Rush's case, he just squished under it in the squishiest way possible. But I'm not actually here today to talk about the various failings of Ocean Gate? Who named this company? Oh, right, the dead guy. Well, that explains a lot. Anyways, I am not here today to talk about the various failings of Ocean Gate. Instead, I am here to talk about how submarines actually communicate in the real world, not when designed by an absolute imbecile. Because apparently Russia's submarine, the Titan, which by the way was renamed, and we already know how bad of an idea that is, right? Anyways, the submarine used some sort of like text message by acoustic signal system. Yeah, no, that's just horrible and there's no reason for it. But even worse, the imbeciles who were trying to convince you that the Titan itself was using Starlink deserve to have things done to them that I probably shouldn't express here on YouTube. Because yes, you see, they're almost right. The expedition itself was actually using Starlink for their communications out in the middle of the ocean, just like every other ship in the world uses Inmarsat or something like that. But the expedition was using Starlink, not the submarine. I mean, Starlink uses what? Super high frequency or extremely high frequency radio waves. Those radio waves won't penetrate past like 8 centimeters into water. The submarine is definitely not using Starlink for communication. And yet your Snopes system was trying to make the claim that it was. I don't know why you people believe that side anymore. So yes, Stockton Rush may have been an idiot. Was an idiot. And I know y'all have rules about speaking ill of the dead and this, that, and the other, but no, really, he was an idiot. Snopes is even bigger of an idiot, and they aren't even trying to pretend they aren't. And that's just kind of pathetic. Especially with their whole song and dance that they're a fact finder, truth seeker, fact checker, whatever the hell they call themselves. That's even worse. So, fine, if EHF and SHF don't work underwater, which they don't, how do submarines keep in touch with the shore? Well, if you can believe it, it's basically 2 cans in a string, and no, I'm not even making that up. I would like to introduce you, although I don't have a good picture of it, to a system otherwise known as UQC. Or AN/WQC-2, or more commonly known as Gertrude. Gertrude is basically what happens when you bolt a speaker and a microphone onto the side of a submarine, and then you bolt a speaker and a microphone onto the side of a surface ship, and then they can talk to each other because sound propagates really, really, really well underwater. Radio waves, not so much. Now, yes, technically, the sound waves being emitted are heterodyned to a higher pitch for greater transmission range and then have to be deheterodyned at the other end. But still, basically, it's just a speaker and a microphone. And yes, technically thermoclines are a problem, and for those of y'all who don't know anything about submarines or whatever, thermoclines are what happen when you have water at a temperature, and then you have water at a different temperature, and the sound waves don't really propagate across the transition between the two different temperature zones very well. Thermoclines are actually ridiculously important for submarines because they allow them to hide basically in plain sight. If you're beneath the thermocline, active sonar probably won't find you, because the sound waves can't make the transition, and even if they can make the transition, they are so far off axis, the return will be absolutely meaningless to the listening sonar system. Well, the same thing applies to Gertrude. If she tries to transmit through the thermocline, it's probably not going to work so well. But that's why someone invented droppable hydrophones. You take the microphone side of Gertrude and you stick it on a really, really long extension cord and you just drop it in the water until it punctures the thermocline, and then you can listen to whatever else is going on down there. So yeah, this is why the Titan's text message by acoustic system is absolutely ridiculous. The whole voice communication over acoustic signals through water problem is solved. It has been solved. In fact, it was solved in 1945. There is no excuse for them to only be relying on text messages transmitted by acoustics. If you're doing acoustics, you might as well talk to the people. And the hilarious thing is that one of the notable aspects of the Titan submarine system, or the Cyclops 2 or whatever they want to call it, is that it regularly lost communication with its mothership. Once again, this is a solved problem. The loss of communication was probably due to it going through a thermocline. So you drop a frickin' hydrophone and you puncture the thermocline and you maintain signal with your boat. I mean, it's not like you don't have paying passengers on board at a... Wait. Whoopsie-doo. I mean, the hilarious thing is this is a hilariously not complicated problem, which I guess Stockton Rush might have known if he had bothered to hire any of those old, uninspiring white guys. Anyways, you may ask yourself, how do I work this? I mean, seriously, screaming into the ocean can't go very far, right? And you're basically right. I mean, sound waves do propagate really, really well underwater, but there's degradation, there's noise, there's the square cube law, there's all these other things, and Gertrude and her various cousins probably can't reach that far, right? And again, you're not wrong. Gertrude is good for a couple nautical miles, if even that, depending on conditions. So seriously, how do submarines stay in contact with the shore? Well, for the longest time, they didn't. For a while there, submarines came in two flavors, and neither of them wanted to talk to anybody. There were the ballistic missile submarines, and there were the fast attack submarines. The ballistic missile submarine's job was to go out into a square of ocean and carve donuts forever and hope they never get noticed, seen, or otherwise observed. The fast attack's job was to go out and find those ballistic missile submarines and tail them, and hopefully also be unobserved while doing that, both by the ballistic missile submarine they're tailing and by anyone else. It was a very, very complicated game of cat and mouse. And for a while there, submarines only received, they never sent. Because as soon as you click the send button on anything, whether it's radio or sonar or Gertrude or whatever the heck it is you're doing, everyone knows where you are. I mean, they might not know exactly where you are, but they certainly have a bearing and a strength of the signal. And once they have a bearing, they'll just go down that bearing until they find you. Now, we'll loop back to the one-sided conversations that submarines didn't have with their shore compatriots. But in modern times, things have changed a little, and submarines are at least allowed occasionally to speak to the shore. And this is mostly, predominantly, somewhat accomplished by something called SOSUS, Sound Surveillance System. It's again another strange acronym that doesn't actually match up to the words that are being said, but you know what, you humies do all kinds of stuff, so it doesn't really matter. SOSUS was originally designed to just listen. It was a bottom-of-the-ocean installed microphone array that was installed all up and down the North Atlantic by your United States, so that they could hear Soviet submarines coming miles and miles away. Fine. The microphones eventually got upgraded with speakers. And now SOSUS is basically the payphone of the deep. If a submarine's steaming around out there, and steaming is a kind of a broad term in this case, they can come up on a SOSUS station and basically interrogate it and say, hey, you got anything for me? And if the station does, it'll broadcast whatever the submarine needs, and that's about it. So basically, they're glorified voice message machines that use the same acoustic signal system that Gertrude does, basically. And the subs know where SOSUS is approximately, and they can send out a ping saying, hey, got any messages? And SOSUS can say, yep, here they are. And then the sub can file its own messages that get back to the shore by way of hard lines that every SOSUS is connected to. Now, this isn't a perfect system. Subs have to know where the SOSUS installations are, they have to go interrogate them, and once again, transmitting is a bad thing for both the submarine and the installation, and so on and so forth, and it's not clear how much data can actually be carried in either direction, but it is still at least a way for two-way communication, which is somewhat rare for submarines. And yes, I understand that the SOSUS has been renamed the Integrated Undersea Surveillance System, otherwise known as the IUSS, but that is a much less interesting acronym to say. At least they have cool insignia. Alright, I know I've been making a whole lot of noise about how this whole Gertrude acoustic transmission system is two-way and can be one-way, of course, and how its two-way aspect, or otherwise known as duplex aspect, is somewhat unusual for submarines, because mostly they only receive, they only listen. Well, like we talked about, if they transmit, they tell the world where they are, and if they just have to listen, well, that has no kind of EW signature to it at all. Now, yes, when they're on the surface and they can send up their mast and everything, they have everything from high-frequency radio to very high-frequency radio and a whole pile of other things, and they can do standard bridge-to-bridge communication and so on and so forth. But when they're on the surface, everyone knows where they are. When they're submerged, it's a little more complicated. Although, I mean, complicated or not, one of the very many uncomfortable things that your Hunt for Red October movie got right is the idea of a towed communication buoy. This was something that your United States pioneered back in the late 1960s, and basically it was a floating semi-submersible, buoy that was, towed by the submarine that was at greater depth than the buoy. So basically they released it out of the top of the submarine on a tether. It floated up to near the surface and then sent up some mass. And even the early models had very low frequency, medium frequency, high frequency, ultra high frequency, and IFF communication, as well as LORAN and NavSat receiving capabilities, which were basically early GPS equivalents at the time. And this was a way for a submarine to remain submerged but still receive fairly normal communications. I mean, HF is still massively used on your planet for reasons that make a certain degree of sense, because it's easily transmittable over long distances, because it ducks between your surface and your stratosphere. It bounces off the ground and it bounces off the higher levels of your atmosphere, and it can be transmitted over long distances. Very low bandwidth, but it can still go forever. So a lot of militaries still use it. Now, technically this buoy, the AN/BSQ-5 buoy to be specific, did have duplex capabilities. It could transmit and it could receive, but by and large it was mostly just used for receiving transmissions. Once again, you don't want to tell the world where you are. Until you do, I guess. We might as well talk about it now. Submarines also had another buoy, technically. It was called a slot buoy. Submarine launched one-way transmitter buoy. I have no idea where the W in that acronym went, but just bear with me, military acronyms never make sense. Basically, slot buoys were the whole science fiction trope of, oh my god, the ship is about to be destroyed, send off a buoy to tell the world, and hopefully the enemy doesn't notice it. Yeah, that's basically what they did. They were yeeted out the side of the submarine, they immediately go to the surface, and then they have some sort of timer built into them that within 0 minutes or 100 hours, they'll start transmitting on normal frequencies in the UHF channel, and they basically hold 120 seconds of a voice message, and they'll keep squawking it until they run out of battery, which might take a while. And then when they're done, they self-scuttle, and that's the end of it. Frequently they were used as decoys simply because they do squawk and people will go look at that thing instead of trying to find the submarine maybe. But also they were used as a one-way communication, once again simplex communication, from the submarine to the shore if the situation called for it. And since they were a releasable buoy from the submarine, and they could be released while the submarine was 150 meters down doing 15 knots, and since the little buoy had a delay timer built into it, well, the submarine might be tens, if not hundreds of miles away by the time the little buoy starts squawking. It's a pretty handy way of keeping your head below the water, so to speak. Anyways, you're right, I have gotten tremendously distracted. Someone should remind me to get back on track periodically. Fat chance of that happening. Okay, anyways, I was supposed to be talking about the ways that submarines receive signals from the shore, aside from the acoustic telephone booths built into the bottom of the ocean, that is. You're right, I should do that. Well, the first and foremost and technically easiest option, although easy in this case is a really sliding scale, is something called very low frequency radio. And yes, I was just talking previously about how radio waves can't penetrate into the ocean. And I was right. The Ka and Ku bands that occupy the super high frequency and the extremely high frequency bands that Starlink uses cannot penetrate into the ocean. But the very low frequency band, well, it occupies the range of 3 to 30 kilohertz. Whereas super high frequency occupies the band of 3 to 30 gigahertz. Now, if any of y'all remember your prefixes for these kind of things, that's a pretty significant difference. The other big difference between super high frequency and very low frequency is that the antennas that you can use for super high frequency probably fit within your arm span. If you stand and hold out your upper appendages as far out as you go, the dishes that SHF uses will fit in that distance that you're covering. On the other hand, very low frequency transmitters specifically require antennae assemblies that cover literal square miles. No, I'm not making that up. Now, the receiving antenna is just a really long trailing wire that the submarine sticks out its hiney. But the transmitter is absolutely huge. In fact, it's so huge that only Norway, the United States, Russia, the United Kingdom, Germany, Australia, Pakistan, and India have ever really gotten around to building them. And the real kicker is that submarines can only receive VLF radio waves when they're within, let's say, 100 meters of the surface, or they can send up one of those towed buoys that hovers just below the surface to do it for them. The problem is, any sub within 100 meters of the surface can probably be detected by a whole pile of systems that are literally designed to detect submarines within about 100 meters of the surface. And once again, trade-offs. And if you're thinking the submarine can just pop up to the surface or near the surface, get whatever signal it needs, and pop back on down before anyone even notices, the transmission rate of VLF data can't even support voice communications. In fact, it's only about 300 bits a second. In other words, it would take literally 7.5 hours for VLF transmissions to be able to send a megabyte of data to the submarine. Some of you might remember 14.4 modems way back in the day. Yeah, this is worse. Basically, this was a way for the shore to send very short, very concise text-based messages to the sub. Like, say, launch codes, for example. Yeah, exciting. But wait, there's more. At least for the Russians, Indians, and Chinese. The United States apparently decommissioned this next installation we're going to talk about. Who knows what they're using these days. But anyways, radio frequency bands are separated into 12 groups, basically, and VLF is one of them, and in fact is number 4. It's not the bottom. There's stuff below VLF. There's ultra low frequency, which is, of course, the step below very low frequency. And then below ultra, there's super low frequency. And finally, we get to extremely low frequency. We're talking about radio waves in the 3 to 30 hertz range. Not kilohertz, not megahertz, not gigahertz, just plain hertz. And just as a reminder, a hertz is a cycle per second. So we're talking about radio waves that are cycling 3 to 30 times per second. Radio waves. In acoustic terms, that falls out of your hearing. Most humans can't hear past 20 hertz. So once you get down to 3 hertz acoustically, you're not picking up on it. And in radio waves, it's absolutely insane. We're talking about wavelengths that are 10 to 100,000 kilometers. That's absurd. And, of course, they'd take that and then figure out that they could use it to communicate to submarines. Because the handy thing about ELF is that it penetrates basically everything. That's what she said. Ocean, land, the entire planet, it doesn't really matter. Because the funny thing is, most ELF transmitting stations actually use the planet, like your world that you are standing on, as the antenna. So first off, they have their own dedicated power supply. And despite having a dedicated power supply, their transmission power is somewhere in the watt range. And the power plant powering them is massively bigger than just in the watt range. And the trick is you have to find a location with really low ground conductivity. Like if you stick 2 probes into the earth in that location, they can't really make a good connection between them. That's the whole point. And then you stick 2 megaprobes miles and miles and miles apart. We're talking like 40 miles apart. And then pump massive amounts of energy through them. And then they finally figure out how to make a connection, literally going through the crust of the earth. And going through the crust is basically how you make your antenna. You turn a massive chunk of your globe into a massive transmitter, and then suddenly the rest of the globe can hear everything you're saying. I mean, are you surprised by the outcome? Now, naturally, the transmission rate of the ELF system was massively slower than the VLF system, on the order of a few characters a minute. And obviously, an error correction algorithm was actually built into the transmissions, and I'm not even going to begin to try to describe that correction algorithm to you, because then it was then immediately encrypted on top of that, and it all gets weird and complicated, and wow, that's a whole separate channel probably. But this system did allow navies to communicate with submarines at actual depth, because once again, a significant chunk of the planet was a transmitter, so the rest of the planet can hear your transmission just fine. And tell that submarine something simple, because again, a few characters a minute, such as come up the depth and we'll tell you what the rest we want to tell you, or if it's just a launch signal, well, hopefully those are brevity concise, right? Now, Beyond Gertrude and her other acoustic transmission cousins, and VLF radio transmissions and ELF radio transmissions, there are a few edge case things that really haven't amounted to much. For example, DARPA, I believe, was experimenting with some sort of blue laser system that was supposed to be able to transmit into the ocean and then transmit out of the ocean without significant loss. Yes, a blue laser transmitting into the ocean. How funny is that? I don't know if anything came of it yet, and if I did, I probably wouldn't be able to talk about it. But the fact remains that OceanGate, and specifically Stockton Rush, because he could not be bothered to hire people who knew what they were doing, went out of their way to build a system that was just a catastrophic failure from stem to stern. Now, shockingly, the good news, depending on how malicious you are, and well, I have a depth of maliciousness we have not yet plumbed. Anyways, the good news is that Mr. Stockton Rush himself was at the receiving end of his idiocy. He got what was coming to him, I suppose. Not because he was rich, just because he was a fucking idiot. No, you shit-stained failure. Old white guys are not inspiring. You know what they are, though? They are goddamned experts in their field, and maybe you should fucking listen to them, as opposed to just firing them when they tell you that whatever the nightmare contraption you're building is not safe. And it turns out it fucking wasn't. And we are here at the shipyard, very sad that Mr. Rush couldn't just test that theory himself by himself. Oh no, he had to sell tickets to the spectacle, and 4 other people are dead now because of him. And yeah, in fairness, not to steal agency from those 4 people, they knew exactly what they were going into. In fact, the disclosure they had to sign actually had a clause in it that basically boiled down to, you might die. And, well, they did. I guess it was truth in advertising after all, right? But the sad thing, the truly pathetic thing, is that if this absolute abject imbecile Mr. Rush himself had actually bothered to pay attention to, much less hire, these old white guys that he so disdained, this all might have been avoided. He might still be alive. His passengers might still be alive. The problem is building submarines is an experiential trade. Yes, lots and lots of people can write stuff down, but the truth is people who do it know stuff that isn't written down. Institutional knowledge is very much a thing. I am sure all of y'all have heard the apocryphal story about the guy who charged, what was it last, $40,000 to come in and put a lead weight on some jet vane for Boeing or something. I don't know. Well, that story is not actually apocryphal, and it might have happened for the United States Navy once upon a time. Nope, totally didn't happen. Never mind. I am totally making that up. But that apocryphal story that never happened is a great example of how you can't just break into these kinds of industries. Or, I mean, you can, but you have to understand that you're going to go through all the birthing pains that the industry did, 70 years ago, the hard way. And, well, again, to his credit, Mr. Rush himself signed on to the hard way and discovered just how hard it is. Maybe don't do that. Maybe actually understand that as uninspiring as it might be, experience has value. Or keep cranking out CEOs who are willing to put their lives on the line, and it's all kinds of entertaining for the rest of you, right? And that's all from Sacred Cow Shipyards. Please be advised that any ship left on the docks for more than 24 hours will be compressed to a cube at the owner's expense. Have a nice day.